I never imagined the deepest betrayal in my life would come wrapped in concern and polite smiles. One afternoon, my son sat across from me, calmly explaining plans for my future that I had never agreed to, while his wife nodded as if my life were already decided. In that moment, I realized I was no longer seen as a mother or a woman with her own will, but as a problem to be managed. What they did not know was that I was carrying a secret that would change everything. And thank God, I kept it to myself. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories connect people from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we are truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, get comfortable, maybe grab your favorite drink, and let's get started. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 67 years old when I learned that a life can look peaceful on the surface and still be quietly vulnerable underneath. I lived alone in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a small adobe house whose thick clay walls had absorbed decades of heat, dust, and memories. From the outside, my life appeared settled and uneventful, the kind of life people describe as calm or simple. At the time, I believed that was a blessing. I had been a high school literature teacher for most of my adult life. Teaching shaped me into someone patient, attentive, and used to placing others first. When my husband became ill, leaving the classroom felt like the obvious choice. Cancer does not negotiate, and love does not keep score. For 3 years, my world narrowed to hospital rooms, medication schedules, and quiet nights listening to his breathing. When he passed away, the silence that followed felt heavier than grief itself. It was not just the loss of a partner, but the loss of purpose that had defined my days. After his death, my life folded inward. Friends checked in at first, then less often. The routines remained. I woke early, brewed coffee, read the local paper, and tended to the house. The house mattered to me more than I realized then. It was where my son Daniel took his first steps, where homework was done at the kitchen table, where laughter once filled the rooms. Every corner carried proof that I had lived for my family. Daniel was my only child, the center of my universe from the moment I held him. I built my life around his needs and ambitions, telling myself that fulfillment would come later. Watching him grow into a successful adult felt like confirmation that my sacrifices had meaning. Even after he moved away, my sense of identity remained tied to him. When he called, my day brightened. When he did not, the hours felt longer. Santa Fe suited the version of myself I had become. The pace was slow, the landscape wide and forgiving. People respected privacy here. No one asked too many questions. That suited me because I had never been one to share more than necessary. This habit of quiet living extended to a matter I had not discussed with anyone, including my son. A few months before my husband passed, I learned that he had inherited a ranch in West Texas assets from a distant relative. It was not a modest piece of land, but hundreds of acres, complete with working facilities and long-established value. He insisted that everything be placed solely in my name. He told me it was not about wealth, but about security. I accepted the paperwork without fully understanding how much it could change my life. After his death, I stored the documents away and returned to my routines. I did not tell Daniel, not out of secrecy or mistrust, but because it felt unnecessary. I had lived my whole life without leaning on money, and I assumed that love within a family made such things irrelevant. Looking back, I realized how firmly I believed that family was an unbreakable safety net. I believed that being a mother earned a kind of lifelong respect that could not be questioned. I believed that devotion would always be recognized, even if it was quiet and unspoken. At that point, I thought I was protected by the very simplicity of my life. I did not yet understand that peace can be mistaken for safety, and that silence, when chosen without intention, can leave doors open that should have been closed. If you are still watching and already sensing that something feels off beneath the surface, comment number 1 below, so I know you are with me, because what I noticed next was subtle, but it changed how I looked at everything that followed. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When Daniel told me he was getting married, the news arrived the way summer storms do in New Mexico: sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a mug at the sink when my phone rang. His voice sounded bright and hurried, layered with a confidence I had not heard in a long time. I congratulated him, of course. I felt the reflexive warmth of a mother whose child is stepping into a new chapter. Still, when the call ended, I noticed my hands were shaking, and I could not explain why. He spoke about Lauren as if she were a solution as much as a partner. She was from Phoenix, Arizona, worked in high-end real estate, and knew how to get things done. He used words like practical and efficient, the kind of praise that carries admiration, but little tenderness. I told myself that love looks different at different ages, that I had no right to expect romance to sound the way it once did. Even so, the speed of everything unsettled me. They had known each other less than a year, and already dates, venues, and plans were in motion. Their first visit to Santa Fe happened a few weeks later. Lauren arrived dressed in clean lines and soft neutrals, her posture straight, her smile practiced. She was polite, never openly dismissive, but her eyes moved constantly, cataloging the house, the furniture, the quiet. She noticed things most guests never do: the age of the windows, the size of the yard, the way the neighborhood sloped. It was not curiosity so much as assessment. During that visit, she asked me questions that sounded caring on the surface. She wanted to know how long I had lived in the house, whether it felt like too much upkeep, what my plans were as I got older. I answered simply, keeping my responses vague. I said I was comfortable, that I enjoyed my routines, that I was healthy. As the words left my mouth, I felt oddly defensive, as if I were justifying my existence rather than sharing my life. What unsettled me most was the way Daniel changed around her. He listened more than he spoke. When I asked him something directly, his eyes flicked toward Lauren before he answered, as though checking for alignment. It was subtle, but I noticed. Mothers always do. I realized that I was no longer the person he instinctively deferred to. That role had quietly shifted. Lauren complimented my lifestyle once, calling it simple and low maintenance. She smiled when she said it, but the words landed heavily. I had built a life of intention and care, not convenience. Her praise felt like a reduction, as if decades of choices could be summarized as minimal effort. I smiled back and said nothing. That night, after they left, I walked through the house alone. I touched the back of the dining chair where Daniel used to sit, the doorframe where his height was once marked in pencil. I wondered when those memories stopped being anchors and started becoming obstacles. I told myself I was imagining problems where none existed. I told myself that marriage rearranges priorities and that good mothers accept the rearrangement gracefully. I also decided, without consciously deciding, to remain quiet about the ranch. It felt private, separate from this new life Daniel was building. I believed that keeping it to myself preserved balance. At the time, it seemed like restraint, not caution. Only later did I understand that unease is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with warnings or demands. It settles in softly, asking to be noticed. And I ignored it, believing that love alone would keep everything steady. If you are still here and starting to feel that quiet unease growing, comment number 2 below to let me know you are following closely. What happened next was the first moment I realized I might be getting pushed aside. Let's continue to chapter 3. The wedding took place at a luxury resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind of place designed to impress before it ever comforts. Palm trees lined the entrance in perfect symmetry, and every surface gleamed as if it had never been touched by real life. I arrived early, as I always do, carrying the quiet hope that there would be something for me to help with, some small role that would make me feel useful and included. Instead, I was greeted by polite confusion. No one seemed to know who I was beyond another guest with a name card. Everything had already been decided. The flowers were arranged, the music rehearsed, the timeline locked. I stood to the side while coordinators moved briskly around me, speaking into headsets, checking lists. It felt less like a family celebration and more like a corporate launch. When I asked where I should sit, a young woman with a clipboard glanced at her chart and pointed toward the middle rows, far from the front. I followed her direction without protest, telling myself that seating arrangements were complicated and that this detail did not matter. From my seat, I could see Daniel only when he turned his head. He looked happy, confident, absorbed in the world that now revolved around him and his bride. Lauren moved through the space with authority, adjusting details, giving instructions, never appearing rushed. She was radiant in a controlled way, every gesture measured. I waited for a moment when our eyes might meet, when she might smile at me as more than a distant relative. That moment never came. As the ceremony unfolded, I became increasingly aware of how invisible I was. When family members were acknowledged, my name was not spoken. When blessings were offered, I was not invited forward. I watched other parents dab at their eyes, embraced by neighbors and friends. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, careful not to draw attention to myself. I told myself that love does not need an audience. At the reception, the pattern continued. I was introduced to strangers as Daniel's mother, without further detail, as if that role alone defined the limits of my importance. I drifted between tables, smiling when spoken to, nodding politely. Each interaction felt rehearsed, courteous, but shallow. Daniel was busy, pulled in every direction. There was no quiet moment for us, no private exchange that acknowledged the years before this day. It was while stepping away from the noise that I heard something that changed how I understood the entire event. I was walking down a hallway near the banquet rooms when I heard Lauren's voice ahead of me, calm and assured. She was speaking to a man I did not recognize. I slowed instinctively, not intending to listen, but her words caught me in place. She mentioned downsizing, spoke of timing, and then said, clearly and without hesitation, that once his mother downsized, the rest would be easy. I stood frozen, my heart beating so loudly I was sure it would give me away. They moved on, their conversation dissolving into laughter and footsteps. I did not follow. I did not confront her. I returned to the reception with my face carefully composed, my mind racing through possibilities I did not yet want to name. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No argument, no scene. I congratulated my son, hugged him briefly, and told him how proud I was. The words felt true and hollow at the same time. When I left that evening, I did so quietly, carrying the weight of a realization I was not ready to share. That day did not break me, but it shifted something fundamental. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that I had been moved aside without being asked. And once that boundary is crossed, it cannot be unseen. If you are still watching and that moment at the wedding made your stomach tighten, comment number 3 below, so I know you felt it too. Because after that day, things only became more calculated and harder to ignore. Now let's move on to chapter 4. The weeks after the wedding passed in a way that felt both slow and abrupt. I waited for Daniel to call with stories about married life, small complaints, or even trivial details the way he used to. At first, I told myself he was busy settling into a new routine. Then, days stretched into longer silences. When my phone did ring, it was rarely him. It was Lauren's number that appeared on the screen, polite and efficient, as if she were managing a schedule rather than answering family. I made small efforts, the kind a mother makes without announcing them. I mailed a belated wedding gift I had taken time choosing, something personal rather than expensive. I left a short voicemail telling Daniel I hoped he was well. I suggested, gently, that I could visit Santa Fe if they ever wanted a quiet weekend away from the city. None of these gestures were refused outright. They were simply absorbed and delayed, answered with vague acknowledgments that led nowhere. Lauren became the filter through which everything passed. When I called, she often answered and explained that Daniel was in a meeting or traveling. When I texted him, responses came hours later, shorter than before, stripped of warmth. Plans were never finalized. There was always a reason to wait. I began to feel as though access to my own son required approval. It was during one of those conversations that the subject of my house surfaced for the first time. Lauren mentioned almost casually that the place must be a lot to maintain on my own. She spoke about safety, about stairs and repairs, about how people my age benefit from fewer responsibilities. Her tone was calm, reassuring, framed as concern. I listened, nodding even though she could not see me, feeling the walls of my home close in around me. Not long after, Daniel repeated similar thoughts during a brief visit. He sat at the edge of the couch, avoiding my eyes, speaking in careful phrases about long-term planning and making life easier. He sounded rehearsed, as if the words had been practiced somewhere else before arriving in my living room. I noticed how often he said we instead of I. It was a small shift, but it carried weight. Inside, I felt something give way. I had always believed my role as a mother was permanent, not subject to negotiation or replacement. Now, I felt myself shrinking, reduced to a variable in someone else's plan. I questioned my reactions, wondering if grief had made me overly sensitive. I reminded myself that parents are meant to step back, to make room. Still, the idea that my home and independence were being discussed without me left a quiet ache that would not settle. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or ask direct questions. Instead, I listened and stored each comment away. I told myself that silence was the wiser choice, that pushing back might create unnecessary tension. I certainly did not mention the ranch. The thought of revealing it felt premature, almost disruptive. At the time, I believed keeping it private protected everyone involved. As days went by, the sense of being edged out became harder to ignore. Conversations revolved around logistics rather than connection. I was no longer asked what I wanted, only what would be easiest. My opinions seemed to arrive already translated into conclusions I had not reached myself. By the end of that month, I understood that my attempts to hold on had changed nothing. If anything, they had confirmed how little space I now occupied in my son's life. There was no dramatic confrontation, no clear turning point, just a steady realization that I was being guided toward the margins with careful smiles and reasonable words. And I remained quiet, believing that patience might still restore what was slipping away. If you are still with me and noticing how concern can slowly turn into control, comment number 4 below to show you are still here. What came next was no longer subtle, and it forced me to face a truth I could not avoid. Let's go to chapter 5. The invitation arrived with a seriousness I could feel before anyone spoke a word. Daniel called and asked if he and Lauren could stop by to discuss something important. His voice carried a careful tone, one I recognized from years of parent-teacher conferences and difficult conversations at school. I agreed, already aware that this would not be a casual visit. When they arrived, they did not bring small talk or warmth. They brought purpose. Lauren introduced the third person as a financial advisor, someone she described as experienced with the family's navigating later stages of life. He dressed neatly, spoke calmly, and carried a thin folder that rested on his knee like a credential. The living room felt smaller with him there, as if my familiar space had been turned into an office without my consent. Daniel sat close to Lauren, his posture attentive, waiting for cues. The advisor began outlining what he called a simplified approach to my future. He spoke about minimizing risk, reducing responsibility, and ensuring stability. The plan unfolded in steps, each one presented as reasonable. First, selling my house in Santa Fe, then consolidating assets into a family trust managed jointly. Finally, relocating me to a senior living community where support would always be available. Each sentence was delivered with the assurance of someone accustomed to agreement. They framed everything as concern. They spoke about my age, about accidents that happen when no one is watching, about the burden of maintenance and decision-making. The words were gentle, but they formed a structure that left no room for my voice. I realized I was not being asked what I wanted. I was being guided toward an outcome already decided. As the explanation continued, I noticed details that unsettled me. The advisor and Lauren exchanged glances that suggested familiarity beyond a first meeting. They used the same phrases, referenced the same assumptions. When he described investment options, Lauren nodded as though she already knew the terms. A memory surfaced of her mentioning business connections in passing, and suddenly the pieces aligned. This was not independent advice. It was coordinated. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet clarity replacing the confusion that had lingered for months. This was not about protecting me. It was about control. I had become a problem to be managed, a variable to be streamlined. The realization hurt more because Daniel was there, listening, participating, allowing this to happen. I watched his face, searching for hesitation, for doubt. What I saw was compliance, shaped by trust in the person sitting beside him. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I asked for time. I said I needed to think, to understand the implications fully. The request seemed to surprise them, as if hesitation had not been part of the script. Lauren responded with reassurance, emphasizing that delays could complicate things. The advisor added that early action prevented regret. Their urgency confirmed what my instincts already knew. After they left, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat alone, replaying every word, every look. I thought about how easily concern can disguise intention, how language meant to soothe can also erase. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the possibility that my silence had been mistaken for weakness. That night, I did not sleep. I walked through each room, touching familiar surfaces, grounding myself in what was real. I thought about my husband, about his insistence on security, about the ranch documents I had tucked away. I understood then that waiting any longer would mean surrendering something essential, not just property, but the right to decide my own life. By morning, the truth was unmistakable. The boundary had been crossed. What began as concern had solidified into a plan, and that plan did not include my consent. From that moment on, I knew I would have to choose between preserving peace and preserving myself. That night, after Daniel and Lauren left, the house did not settle the way it usually did. The quiet felt alert, as if the walls themselves were listening. I moved from room to room without purpose, replaying the meeting in fragments. The words were calm, reasonable, wrapped in concern, yet they pressed against me with a weight I could not ignore. I realized I had crossed from unease into certainty, and certainty is not something a person can unlearn. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the same place where I had once graded papers and helped my son with homework. I asked myself whether I was being unfair, whether grief had sharpened my suspicions beyond what was reasonable. Mothers are taught to doubt themselves first. We are trained to soften our edges, to interpret discomfort as misunderstanding. Still, the memory of that coordinated plan would not loosen its grip. It had been presented as care, but it had removed my voice entirely. What hurt most was not the proposal itself, but Daniel's presence within it. He had not questioned the assumptions. He had not asked me what I wanted. He had spoken about my life as though it were already being packed away. I understood then that love, when filtered through influence, can become something unrecognizable. That understanding settled into me with a quiet finality. I thought of my husband, of the months before his death when he insisted on putting everything in order. He had been practical without being cold, protective without being controlling. He told me more than once that independence is easiest to lose when people believe they are helping you. At the time, I nodded without fully listening. That night, his words returned with clarity. The ranch he left me was not simply an asset. It was a safeguard, a reminder that I was capable of standing on my own. Two paths opened in front of me, stark and unavoidable. One led toward agreement. I could sign the papers, accept the plan, and preserve the appearance of harmony. I could convince myself that compromise was maturity, that peace was worth the price. The other path led toward resistance. It carried uncertainty, conflict, and the possibility of damaging my relationship with my son. But it also preserved something I had not named until then: my right to decide. I hesitated at the thought of being labeled difficult. Women my age are expected to be grateful, accommodating, and quiet. We are praised for yielding and criticized for asserting boundaries. I imagined the looks, the sighs, the subtle judgment that would follow if I pushed back. For a moment, that fear almost swayed me. Almost. What stopped me was the realization that agreeing would not actually keep the peace. It would only delay the loss. Each concession would invite another, until there was nothing left to negotiate. Silence had already cost me space. More silence would cost me myself. I did not confront anyone the next morning. Instead, I acted carefully. I searched for legal guidance, choosing someone with experience protecting older adults from financial coercion. Making that call felt like stepping into cold water, shocking but necessary. I spoke plainly, explained my situation, and listened as the pieces aligned into a pattern I could no longer deny. When the call ended, my hands were trembling, but my thoughts were steady. For the first time in months, I felt a shift from helplessness to agency. I was still afraid. That did not change. But fear no longer dictated my choices. I understood that protecting my future did not require permission. It required resolve. As dawn crept through the windows, I knew the choice had been made. I would no longer mistake pressure for care or silence for strength. Whatever came next would be difficult, but it would be mine to face. If you are still watching and wondering what happens when someone finally stops staying silent, comment number 6 below to let me know you are ready. Because in the next chapter, everything they planned started to fall apart. Now let's move on to chapter 7. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, chosen deliberately, I suspected, to give it the air of routine business rather than confrontation. Daniel and Lauren arrived together, carrying folders and an unmistakable sense of urgency. They moved through my house with familiarity that no longer felt earned, setting papers on the dining table as if the outcome were already agreed upon. I greeted them calmly, aware that my composure was the only thing keeping the balance in my favor. Lauren spoke first, outlining the purpose of the visit with the same careful tone she had used before. She emphasized efficiency, timing, and the importance of acting before complications arose. The documents were arranged neatly, signatures marked, instructions highlighted. The pressure was subtle but constant, woven into every pause. I listened without interrupting, letting the moment stretch longer than they expected. Before anything could proceed, I asked that the process be properly documented. I explained that I wanted clarity and transparency, not because I was confused, but because decisions of this magnitude deserved care. The request introduced a faint ripple of tension. Lauren's expression tightened, though she quickly recovered. Daniel looked uncertain, shifting in his chair. Still, no one objected outright. When my attorney arrived, the atmosphere changed immediately. The living room no longer felt like a family space. It became formal, measured, and unmistakably legal. Introductions were made, credentials noted. The folders on the table were opened again, this time examined rather than assumed. Lauren's confidence dimmed as the conversation moved away from reassurance and towards structure. Questions were asked with precision. My attorney inquired about the advisor's relationship to Lauren, about how the trust had been drafted, about why independent counsel had not been suggested for me earlier. Each question was calm, professional, and difficult to evade. Answers came more slowly now. The ease with which the plan had been presented days earlier began to fracture. As the scrutiny continued, I felt something unexpected surface within me. It was not triumph or anger, but steadiness. I was no longer the person being explained to. I was the person whose consent mattered. When it became clear that the narrative being built around my vulnerability could not withstand examination, I chose that moment to speak. I explained that I had not been forthcoming about my financial position because I had not been asked in good faith. I then disclosed the existence of the ranch in West Texas, the inheritance placed solely in my name by my husband. I described it not as leverage, but as evidence. Evidence that I was not dependent, not incapable, and not in need of management. The room fell silent in a way that felt definitive. Daniel looked stunned, as though seeing me for the first time rather than the version he had grown accustomed to. Lauren's reaction was sharper, a flash of disbelief quickly masked on by calculation. The advisor shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less invested in his earlier assurances. The foundation of the plan had relied on a premise that no longer held. The meeting ended without signatures. What had been framed as a necessary step forward was formally paused, pending further review. My attorney gathered the documents, his movements deliberate, signaling closure. Lauren attempted to reassert control, but her words lacked authority now. The structure she had relied on had collapsed under its own assumptions. After they left, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer. I sat alone at the table where the papers had been spread, noticing how quickly the sense of intrusion faded once the threat was removed. The outcome had not resolved everything. Relationships do not repair themselves in a single afternoon, but something essential had been restored. For the first time since the wedding, I felt safe in my own home. Not because conflict had been avoided, but because it had been faced. The plan that once loomed over my future had unraveled, and in its place stood the quiet certainty that I was no longer willing to be managed out of my own life. The days following that meeting were quiet, in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. There were no urgent calls, no documents to review, no sense of being watched. The absence of pressure left room for something I had not felt in a long time: clarity. I noticed how differently I moved through my house, how my shoulders no longer tensed at the sound of the phone. The threat had passed, but the lesson remained. With my attorney's guidance, I completed the legal safeguards we had discussed. The trust was finalized, irrevocable, and precise. Authority was defined, boundaries documented, and my consent placed at the center of every future decision. The process was thorough, even comforting. For the first time, protection did not feel like something others claimed to provide me. It was something I had claimed for myself. Daniel reached out during that time, cautiously. His messages were shorter than apologies and longer than excuses, as though he were searching for the right shape of words. I responded kindly but without urgency. I did not reopen old wounds or rush toward reassurance. Instead, I let the distance exist, trusting that space can be honest when conversation cannot. I had learned that closeness without respect is not closeness at all. As the weeks passed, I began to understand that remaining in Santa Fe would keep me tethered to a version of myself shaped by compromise. The house held too many echoes of decisions made for others. I loved it, but love does not require permanence. When the idea of moving to the ranch returned to me, it no longer felt theoretical. It felt necessary. The first time I arrived in West Texas, as its owner, rather than a custodian of papers, the land greeted me with a scale I had forgotten existed. The horizon stretched without interruption. The air carried dust and warmth and possibility. I walked the perimeter slowly, listening to the wind move through tall grass, feeling the ground steady beneath my feet. There was work to be done, certainly, but it was honest work. It answered to effort rather than expectation. Living there changed my rhythm. Mornings began with light instead of clocks. Evenings ended with quiet that felt expansive rather than empty. I learned the patterns of the land, the way weather announced itself, the way space teaches patience. In that environment, I felt my age not as a limitation, but as an accumulation of knowledge. I had lived long enough to recognize when something was wrong and strong enough now to act on it. Daniel visited once, alone. He moved carefully, as if unsure where to stand. We spoke about practical matters and left deeper questions untouched. I observed rather than responded, listening for sincerity instead of promises. I did not offer forgiveness, nor did I withhold it. I allowed the relationship to find its footing on new terms, ones that did not require me to shrink. What surprised me most was how quickly my sense of self adjusted. I stopped measuring my worth by how accommodating I could be. I stopped anticipating needs that were never voiced. The habits of deference fell away, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Autonomy does not announce itself. It settles in gradually, until one day it feels natural. As I looked out over the land at sunset, I understood that rebuilding does not always mean repairing what was broken. Sometimes it means choosing differently. I was not retreating from family or responsibility. I was returning to myself. And in that return, I found a steadiness I had not known I was missing. If you are still here and want to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below so I know you are staying with me until the end. What comes next is not about revenge, but about what remains when control is gone. Let's move on to the final chapter. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges without erasing the truth beneath them. By the time the season shifted again in West Texas, my life had settled into a steady rhythm. The urgency that once defined every interaction was gone. In its place was a quiet awareness of where I stood and what I would no longer tolerate. Distance, I learned, does not always mean separation. Sometimes it simply means clarity. News of Daniel's marriage reached me indirectly, without drama. Lauren withdrew from his life the same way she had entered it, decisively and without lingering explanations. There were no confrontations, no attempts to reframe the past. She stopped calling, stopped appearing in conversation, and eventually stopped mattering. Their marriage ended not with spectacle, but with inevitability. What had been built on control could not survive without it. Daniel came to see me several months later. He arrived alone, without announcement, and waited until I finished my morning walk before speaking. There was a restraint in him I had not seen before, a humility shaped by loss rather than apology. He did not defend himself or place blame elsewhere. He spoke about confusion, about trusting the wrong voice, about how easily certainty can be borrowed when it feels reassuring. I listened without interruption, allowing him the dignity of being heard. What struck me was not what he said, but what he did not ask for. He did not ask me to fix things or to restore what had been broken. He did not seek absolution. Instead, he acknowledged the harm caused by his choices and accepted that rebuilding would take time. That restraint told me more than words could have. I told him that love had never been the issue. Control had. I made it clear that I was still his mother, but no longer someone whose life could be rearranged for convenience. The boundary was not delivered as an ultimatum, but as a fact. Respect, once lost, does not return through regret alone. It returns through consistency. Our relationship did not reset. It recalibrated. We spoke occasionally, met without expectation, and allowed trust to find its own pace. I no longer waited by the phone or shaped my days around his availability. I chose when to engage and when to step back. That choice, once reclaimed, became the foundation of everything else. I did not feel the need to punish anyone. I had no interest in proving a point or revisiting grievances. What mattered was that I no longer lived in reaction to someone else's plans. The freedom I gained came with losses, yes, but also with honesty. I accepted both. Standing on the porch at dusk, watching the land darken into stillness, I understood that not all endings require closure. Some simply require acceptance. What fell apart did so because it could not stand without compromise. What remained was quieter, stronger, and entirely my own. Mornings on the ranch begin without urgency. Light moves slowly across the land, touching the grass before it reaches the house, as if asking permission. I sit on the porch with my coffee and let the day arrive in its own time. There is no one waiting for me to decide quickly, no one measuring my usefulness or planning my future without me. In this quiet, I understand how far I have come. For most of my life, I believed that silence was a duty. I stayed quiet to keep peace, to avoid conflict, to make room for others. I mistook restraint for kindness and patience for safety. What I did not realize was that silence, when chosen without awareness, can become an invitation. It invites assumption. It invites control. It invites people to believe they know what is best for you simply because you have not said otherwise. When my son got married, I never told him about the ranch my husband left me. At the time, it felt irrelevant. Money was not how I defined myself, and I did not want it to complicate family dynamics. Only later did I understand how that silence protected me. If I had spoken too soon, my privacy would have been reframed as opportunity. My independence would have been labeled excess. Thank God I did not tell him, because withholding that truth allowed me to see intentions clearly before revealing my position. There is a difference between hiding and waiting. I was not hiding out of fear. I was waiting until I understood the terrain. Silence gave me time to observe patterns, to notice how concern was expressed, how decisions were shaped, how easily my voice was removed from conversations about my own life. By the time I chose to speak, I was not pleading to be heard. I was asserting what was already mine. Finding my voice did not require anger. It required grounding. When I spoke, I did so with clarity, supported by preparation and self-trust. That is the power of speaking at the right moment. Words land differently when they are backed by resolve rather than desperation. I think often about women my age who are told, gently and persistently, that their best years are behind them. We are encouraged to simplify, to step aside, to let others manage what we have built. Care is offered conditionally, tied to compliance. What we are rarely told is that autonomy does not expire. Experience is not a weakness, and love does not require surrender. Family, I have learned, is not defined by proximity or obligation. It is defined by respect. Boundaries are not walls. They are agreements that allow relationships to exist without harm. When those boundaries are ignored, distance becomes an act of self-preservation, not punishment. Today, I live without apology. I make decisions slowly and deliberately. I choose connection when it is mutual and step back when it is not. I am still a mother, still capable of love, but I am also a woman with a life that belongs to her. The silence that once kept me small saved me when I used it wisely, and the voice I finally claimed did not need to be loud. It only needed to be mine. Stories like this are not really about loss or conflict. They are about awakening. They remind us that dignity does not disappear with age, and that experience sharpens vision rather than dulls it. When trust is misplaced, clarity becomes a teacher. When silence is chosen wisely, it becomes protection. And when a voice is finally used with intention, it has the power to redraw an entire life. At its heart, this story is a reminder that love without respect slowly turns into control, and that boundaries are not rejection, but self-preservation. Independence is not selfish. It is the foundation that allows relationships to exist without fear or resentment. It is never too late to reclaim authority over one's own choices. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience may help someone else feel less alone. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow the channel so you do not miss future stories. Together, we keep these conversations alive.